a lot of times it's just a very flippant decision on how to title things.
Right.
There's really not much thought put behind it, and it can have very long consequences.
I have Larry Alderson in the studio with me this morning. Larry is also a CFP professional like myself, so CFP in the house.
Yeah.
Larry's been working with Stonehouse now, and I was excited to have you as a team member. And Larry, the more we work together, the more I kind of feel like there's got to be I might have to do a 23andMe ancestry test or something, because we might not look alike, but I feel like we are kindred spirits, and maybe it's the experience we have. How long have you been doing this?
Just 30 now. Yeah, 30
years.
Just 30. Yeah. But seems like we've been on a parallel track or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. My mindset's a lot different than the first year or two I first started in the business, and I think that's pretty natural for any industry. But I think what I'm excited about today is to talk with you about some of the things. And great example you've brought up. We have financial planning meetings as a team. We get together once a week, share ideas, talk about things that are going on in the industry, but also collaborate a lot with each other. And that's one of my favorite parts of the week, really. And one of the things that you've said recently, we talked about how assets are titled. You brought that up, and the importance of paying attention to that. So I would love today if you would drop some of that knowledge, some of that 30 years of experience, and share with us. We talked about some things you'd like to mention. So where do you want to start with it, the importance of titling assets?
Well, I think, of course, as you remember, as a lot of people might know, I worked in a financial institution, a bank, for 24 years. And a lot of times it's just a very flippant decision on how to title things.
Right.
There's really not much thought put behind it, and it can have very long effects, very long consequences. And so
there's an urgency to get the account set up. Like, I want to open an account. Okay, great. The easiest way to get it open that day, that moment is usually the path taken.
And quite often people will say, well, I can always change this, right? And the answer is yes, but human nature takes over and it doesn't.
Yeah.
So it's just something that we've seen really have some unintended nasty consequences sometimes that people don't think about until it happens. And then it's worth understanding just how important that is.
Yeah.
One of the situations that we had talked about is, in that type of a situation, one person comes in and they feel an urgency to set up a relationship with a financial account, and the other person isn't there. They're a married couple, and one person can come and the other person can't. And so they just set it up in that person's name. Mm-hmm. And that's all well and good until that person dies or something happens to that person. They become incapacitated, and they may or may not have all of their estate planning documents in order. And all of a sudden they may have a probate estate when they wouldn't have needed to. And it's just, that's one scenario that you see happen. And again, not to say that you shouldn't always, or not to say that you sometimes wouldn't want to have an individually owned account as a married couple, but you want to think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The bottom line to all of that titling discussion is you really just want to think through what the ramifications are of that decision as opposed to a snap decision.
Yeah, and it's really based on really two things: what's happening in the account during your lifetime, and then once I'm gone, what happens to that account, right? And titling means everything.
It means everything. That's the law.
A lot of people, and I know you've seen this because I have. I'll use a revocable trust, a great example. somebody went and they were convinced that they need to put all their assets in a revocable trust, and it can avoid probate, and it can be much less public and whatever reasons. And then they'll put an account in front of me and say, I'm interested in moving this account with you. And you look and it's not in the name of the trust. It's just individually owned. And they say, well, that's part of my trust. And you're like, it's not really. Not today. It's not. Not that it can't be, but just an example. Or maybe they opened it after they did the trust and they didn't even think about the planning they had done by setting that all up.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot where people open things or buy a piece of property and they forgot that they don't understand the fact that, or forget that they have this trust. And as they bought a piece of real estate and they didn't title it in the name of the trust, they titled it in their own name.
Right.
And there's a method usually in the will to push things that they might have forgotten through the trust, but then that'll have to go through probate. So
which kind of defeated
the purpose of the trust to begin with. So
right.
Yeah.
Easy fixes, right? But somebody has to be paying attention.
That's right.
So it's either the client, or a lot of time it falls on our desk.
It is. And it's these types of things probably aren't going to ever get brought up by a distant financial planner, or a distant financial company if they're dealing with, I don't know if we should be talking about companies by name in this format, but all of our clients are probably solicited by out of town
right.
Or more sterile, distant
national brands,
or even sometimes local representation of bigger companies. But you really need to have this relationship with a one-on-one with somebody that knows, gosh, I thought you had a revocable trust. Why isn't this titled that way?
Right.
Why is this account titled individually as opposed to jointly? It's not that it shouldn't be. It's just, did anybody ask that question?
Yeah.
Has the circumstance changed from 20 years ago when you opened it?
That's right. It's also like knowing your client, right? So we build relationships with the folks we work with. I would wager say most of them are pretty good friendships too. You're excited when you see them in and around town. And when somebody says something and you can, when you have that relationship, you can say, the last time we talked about this, you wanted to leave this to your son. Is something changed there? Because the way you're set up, it's not doing that. And sometimes there might be a reason.
Yeah.
And other times they might go, what? Wait a minute. No, I thought everything was all aligned. And you're like, no, there's a conflict here. We have to make sure we resolve it.
Which reminds me of another situation that involves titling that we've seen happen. I call it unintentional disinheritance, where let's suppose mom has 4 kids and loves them all, and the will says divide the assets all equally, but because the one child lives closer and provides more assistance to her as she gets older, she has added her as a joint owner to her accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that joint owner is going to inherit all of that when that mom dies, and leave those other 3 wondering what's going on here, and potentially have some angst between them. Might make family reunions tense.
And that's a good way. What you call unintentional disinheritance.
Yeah, where mom didn't mean to cut the other 3 out,
right?
But because she had built up the assets in these joint accounts, and sometimes it happens gradually. It was initially started for a convenience purpose with the daughter, but there was only maybe a couple $1,000s in it. But for whatever reason, that account just builds, and then all of a sudden it might actually hold a lot more of the person's assets as a percentage of the whole than what it did at first. So it just bears a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as a parent, right? And I know I've seen this a lot where somebody the last, like, you're more worried about how can I transition my assets when I'm gone in an equal way usually, but also in a way that doesn't disturb. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm lucky my kids are getting along well, or, it's a little bit precarious. I don't want the money to come in between my kids. And then because of an inadvertent mistake, like you're saying, an oversight, you all of a sudden throw in that grenade that kind of blows up the relationship.
Right. And
that's a parent's nightmare.
It is. I mean, they would be literal, not literally, but be figuratively rolling over in the grave that we all talk about. Most of the time, there's not a greater desire for most parents than to want to know that their families are going to be harmonious and loving and tight, and dropping money in a group that's uneven, or not to say that you can't do it unevenly either, but because there's no requirement that, as you know, that people get treated 100% equally, but there should be it wants to be understood, so that if it's not going to be equal, that you understand that, and that the parents understand that it's not equal and what the consequences are. Yeah.
This is great. I think that my takeaway from this that I'd love for folks watching to understand is titling is super important. I will hear a lot of people say, it's all right, I already did my will, I took care of it in the will. And you might say, well, this asset is titled, in a way that makes me concerned. No, I got it all. It's all handled in the will. People need to understand that the title of an account can override whatever the will says. It might never ever make it to the will having any sort of power here.
Yeah, people don't understand that the will is the last
for whatever's left.
It's for whatever's left that can't be figured out who's supposed to get it after somebody dies. If we can't, it's not, the will isn't looked to if you can figure out who's supposed to get it without going to the will. So if there's a beneficiary designation on it, nobody's going to look at the will for that asset. Yeah. If there's a joint owner, nobody's going to look at the will for that asset.
Right. And when you say beneficiaries, and if you're watching this and you've recently been divorced, make sure you're updating your beneficiaries.
Well, you want to talk about unintentionally disinheriting somebody. How about if it's your wife?
Yeah.
Talk about.
That's another podcast right there. Okay. What else on titling that we need to talk about?
I think one thing that sometimes people really a goal for the retitling is to reduce Pennsylvania inheritance tax. And a lot of our clients, we're in Pennsylvania. A lot of our clients are in Pennsylvania. If you're subject to Pennsylvania inheritance tax and you put a co-owner on it, put one co-owner on it, Pennsylvania looks at that as being owned only one half by you. So if mom puts daughter on that account, all of a sudden, only half of that account's going to be subject to inheritance tax when mom dies. Mm-hmm. Mom needs to be comfortable with the fact that daughter's going to get all of that account. And also, if daughter happens to die first, mom's going to pay inheritance tax on her own money because Pennsylvania looks at it as being owned by the daughter, half owned by the daughter. Yeah. So, again, if the world works the way it's supposed to, it might not be a bad thing, but there's consequences.
Yeah, you just need to do some planning, some thinking through that. Absolutely, yeah. One more thing with titling and things like that, estate planning. A lot of people think for long-term care kind of planning that, and I've seen this work, and I've also seen it blow up family situations. I want to move some money out of my name and into my kids' names. So, you have any experience on that you want to share with everybody?
Yeah, I mean, we have that conversation a fair bit. Everybody's afraid of the boogeyman of the long-term care costs, nursing home costs.
You can't say boogeyman on a podcast. No, I'm just kidding.
Probably not.
That's fine.
It's a very real problem. I mean, they're very expensive, so people are trying to make sure their family gets their house or their portfolio. And so I want to get it out of my name, put the kid's name on it. And like you said, it may work, may not work. And we really need to give the caveat that competent legal advice is in order if you're going to do that. And one of the reasons is for instance, if you retitle that property, whether it's financial or real estate or whatever the property is, what happens if that person dies? What happens if the son, if you're going to give your house to your son, what happens if your son dies?
Mm-hmm.
It's his property. It's probably going to wind up going through his will.
Right.
Or if he has a will, what happens if he doesn't have a will?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of problems. What happens if he gets sued? What happens if he gets divorced? That is, all of those things are now tied up in his life and his decisions and ramifications of those things. And you might be protecting against, you might be trying to protect against a nursing home cost that doesn't ever happen.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
you wind up not protecting yourself at all. You might wind up going from the frying pan into the fire, so to speak.
Yeah, there can be unintended consequence for that, for sure. I definitely have seen. I've seen it work,
Mm-hmm.
and I've seen it work exactly by design, and almost could not have drafted it up any better. But there is a. I think it's important. I think you just hit on it there. What people need to understand, the percentages. Our job, let's face it, our job's really about probabilities, right? You kind of brace for the worst, but you plan for the most expected things, right? And when it comes to long-term care planning, there's a certain percentage of, I don't know how these, I should probably know the stats off my head, but there's a percentage of us that will need long-term care.
I think the stats that I read are like 1 in 4.
Okay.
So, which is a pretty high percentage, really. I mean,
Right.
if 1 in 4 planes were going down, I probably wouldn't fly much.
All right, that's actually really good perspective, right? But of those that need long-term care, how much of it is in a certain type of facility? How long is that stay? And how do you find the protection? What does it basically do to your assets, or could it do? And then when you factor all that in, I think ultimately what it boils down to is a lot of folks will look at a conversation with us first that ultimately might lead to an estate planning attorney. And there are some elder law care attorneys that are really good out there. But a common thing I hear is that the attorneys who are really good at doing that kind of planning charge a lot. And I just had a conversation with somebody that said, I went to an elder law attorney, and it was $12,000 that they wanted me to pay. And I didn't know anything about this person's situation. It was a very casual conversation. And they said, that's really stupid for me to pay that. And I said, I don't know the answer, because I have no idea what your assets are worth. If you were going to pay $12,000 to get amazing advice and monitoring of your estate as you go forward, because I think that's important. As time changes, you set it up like that when you're 60, and then when you're 70, things are different. Is it still on pace, But if you were going to spend $12,000 and maybe some more to monitor it to save hundreds of thousands for your family, or even more, then that seems like a bargain.
Right. And what the question is, what are you protecting? Would you pay 2%, 3%, 4% of your assets once to protect it forever?
Right.
And I don't know that. Yeah. And there are consequences to all that planning. That's really beyond the scope of, I think, what we're talking about here.
It is. Yeah.
We are one of a person's advisors. They should. I've often heard our role, or what a client should have, is like a team, and the advising team is kind of like a 3-legged stool. You should have a tax advisor, you should have a good legal advisor, and you should have a good financial advisor. And just like a 3-legged stool, if you take one of those legs away, you're probably don't have a very stable stool.
Yep. Yeah, and they need to play well together.
And they need to play well together. And I feel really blessed to be on this team, because it's clear. I mean, we work with a lot of different attorneys and a lot of different accountants. And the end goal, especially as a registered investment advisor and being fiduciaries, is to do what's in the best interest of the client.
Yep.
What a great position to be in.
Yeah, I think the job is easier when you have that position.
That's right.
You don't have to. You're not selling something. You're just saying, if I were you, this is what I would do, and this is why.
Exactly.
And you have to feel good about that recommendation, because a lot of our clients take it, and you want to sleep at night, and you want them to sleep well too. So
You want that meeting in the grocery store to be a happy one.
yeah, that's right. That's right. This has been great. I think ultimate takeaway is, when it comes to titling, if you have any questions, if you haven't reviewed it, talk to a financial advisor, talk to an attorney. Ultimately, I think an attorney should kind of sign off on these things to make sure especially if you have a will or a trust, other legal things going on, make sure all these documents are in sync, right?
Yeah, right. I've often looked at the relationship similar to like the architect and the contractor, where the attorney is kind of like the architect and we're kind of like the contractor.
Sure, yeah.
The attorney sometimes draws up the plan, like your comment about the revocable trust, and then the client goes away and goes living their life, and without ever touching base with somebody that's also part of the team, they go on and don't really follow the plan.
Yeah, accidentally undo it.
So the contractor if we've been part of a building experience before, where you're building a house or whatever, if you've got the architect and the contractor and they like each other and they're working together, it's a much better experience. A much better house will be built.
Yeah. And from growing up with a family of contractors, I can say that if the architect needs to understand how things actually get put together, because you can draw plans up that are
the house won't stand.
Right?
Yeah,
That's right. That's right. So that's our job. Stone house, strong house will help everybody make their house a little bit stronger and on stable ground, and make sure it can work in the future. Make sure it's on track to do the things that they intend. That's as you put it. So, Larry, thank you very much on titling. This has been really beneficial. I hope people get a lot out of it.
You're welcome. Thank you.